now going to talk about movements which are really important for guard retention, and these movements apply across a broad range of guard retention scenarios, so not one particular type of guard passing. There are other movements that will be covered in the specific guard passing scenarios as well, the ones that apply to that particular guard pass or guard retention type. The 5 movements we're going to cover are the high pummel, the gongoa, the invert, the leg dab, how to use your elbows to move around the ground. And we're also going to just go through a quick overview of the ways you can reface your hips if your opponent turns your hips away. In this, we're going to talk about the movement themselves and potentially the common mistakes people make in the movement, but we won't be talking about the scenarios so much. The scenarios will come up later when we do those particular topics. We'll talk about why you're going to do these movements, like what it achieves, but the actual scenarios will be covered later. So a big part of this instructional is that we are going to be using invert and invert type motions quite a lot. So some people don't like to invert. If you don't like to invert, there is going to be things in here that are useful. You probably will miss quite a lot of what's going to be useful though in terms of like defending these particular types of passes and in this way. So I just wanted to address whether you should be inverting and whether it is bad for your body. I think if you have the right mobility and if you use the invert at the right time, it's actually very safe. Okay, but if you are inverting when you shouldn't and you're trying to fight it at the wrong points, or if you're quite immobile, I think it is potentially a bad idea, and you should probably stretch first before inverting if that's the case. So you might want to just focus on our mobility section first before you actually get into some of the invert related techniques if that's the case. So basically a simple test. If you roll your feet back, and first of all, can you touch your feet on the ground? If you can't touch your feet on the ground, then that means you want to stretch your hamstrings. If you can touch your feet on the ground and you can still lift your head off the ground like I can here, that means my neck is safe when I get stacked. Okay, so if I happen to get stacked from an invert and I can lift my head up, then that means my neck's not taking load. Okay, if you're less flexible, for example, if my feet can't extend here and I get stacked like this and my weight's on my head and I can't lift it, it means my neck could take strain and that could cause injury. Okay, so I would recommend stretching quite a lot and until you can get to that point, right? The other thing, or you bail early. You can try to invert, and if you feel like you're getting stacked, you kind of just let them kind of go, all right? Another really important thing is not to push against a stacked position. The worst thing you can do when you're stacked, if I'm like this, is to actually like push against my opponent. I'm in a fully flexed position on my back, and then I'm pushing against it, creating a lot of compressive load on my spine. It's like you're adding load to your spine by fighting it. You're better off kind of framing and letting it go if you're feeling uncomfortable in the position. All right, so try not to fight the invert. And then the last thing is just make sure when you do an invert properly, there really should be no weight on you. You shouldn't get fully stacked because you're spinning underneath when their weight's off you, not on you. So a big problem people have is they try to invert when they actually shouldn't, and they kind of get like stuck here and then they get stacked. When we invert, it's often we're framing our opponent away and we're going underneath our own weight to recover, and there's no real pressure on us. The gongoa or gangoha is actually, I don't actually know how to pronounce it, to be honest, because I was always told this movement was called the gongoa, which meant seesaw, and every person I ever who spoke Portuguese that I ever said gongoa to, they looked at me with a blank expression. I said, like a seesaw, and they never got it. And then I found out the translation for seesaw is gangoha, which is quite similar but a little different, and obviously they didn't make that that connection. So we're going to go through the gangoha or gongoa. Now, this is it's a way of, we basically turn away. It's a way of facing your opponent again when your hips get turned. Okay, so my hips get turned and I want to face my opponent again, but they're blocking me from just turning straight back towards them. So we're going to use this action where I'm going to curl my shoulder in, put my foot to the ground here, lift my hips and tuck underneath so that you end up with your head in between your legs and facing your opponent in front of you again. Another purpose of the gongoa can be to shift your hip position. So sometimes your partner's here and your hips are here, and I want to get my hips to the other side of my opponent, especially if I'm facing this way. So I might even end up the movement facing this way still, but my hips end up on the other side of them, which means I'm not facing them now. And I'm now facing them if they're in the same spot. So we can actually reshift our hips by doing this same sort of roll. So the first thing with this movement that we want to make sure we do is you want to tuck your foot in, okay? Or at least to a certain degree, okay? The common mistake that we see is people kind of falling to the side with the foot out. And unless you're really flexible, it's going to be much more difficult to get underneath your leg here. And it's very hard to push off that leg to reclaim your position. By tucking my foot back, it gives me room to see. I can kind of roll underneath my foot and I can push off to lift my hips and I can't roll my shoulders underneath here. When I push off the ground with my toes facing down, my hips lift and I can roll under that space and bring my hips back. Another common mistake we see with the gongoa is people lifting their hips too high. I actually want to keep my hips as low as possible. So it's not uncommon to see people kind of like go here, the hips up and roll back like that. This gives my opponent a chance to get behind my back. I want to do this with my hips as low as possible. So I actually kind of, as I'm bringing my head through, I'm dragging my hips out low, and it's going to be a much lower way to get back together and harder for our opponent to get underneath our hips. Another common mistake with this is to push the hips away instead of kind of lifting and giving yourself room to go underneath. So it's not uncommon to see someone kind of turn and push like off the ground and like this. I need to make sure my shoulders really go underneath. So as I come up, I need to roll my head through. You're getting on your shoulder and pivoting on that shoulder so that your head ends up in between your hips and your legs come back. So in summary, for the gongoa, I turn to my side, tuck my elbow in, bend foot to the ground, turn, lift your hip, get on your shoulder and tuck your head through. Once you're here, roll so that your shoulders are flat, open your legs and drop your hips. All throughout, trying not to lift your hips too high. If you're struggling with the gongoa movement, you can practice it from like a kneeling turtle position and roll through, and then practice rolling to turtle, going back to the gongoa, and that can be a good intro to this movement. So I'm going to put my left shoulder down to the ground, my toes are on the mat, and I'm going to lift my hips. Okay. Now from here, I want to bring my head in between my legs. So I pivot on that shoulder and I roll my head through. Okay, so I've got both feet over the top, my head facing up. Once I'm there, I open my legs and roll. Okay, then you can practice turning to turtle all the way out, tucking that shoulder, looking as you drop that shoulder, obviously look away from the shoulder that's down. Lift your hips, staying on that shoulder, and then tuck your head between your legs. Roll through, and we start the action again.
Now see a few examples of the gongoa in action. So there's Ari using the gongoa as his leg gets turned. And here we are. Here's a good example of the gongoa. When my opponent pushes my legs away, I'm being turned away. I frame and I'm going to bring my head in and hips towards my opponent. Like so, to square up and straighten my legs. Then I'll have to do it again as I've now gone under the legs. I'm going to start to throw my legs to the side again. I use the same action and it recovers my feet back in front.
common movement that we're going to be referring to throughout this instructional is the high pummel. This is a really important movement that you need to know, and it allows you to defend pretty much all different types of guard passes, whether it's a through the legs pass, around the legs pass, or an under the legs pass. The high pummel is basically a really good alternative to the hip escape because you don't have to separate your either of your knees from your chest in the process, and it allows you to square up with your opponent and create distance between yourself and your opponent without giving up any kind of position, without giving up your knee line or giving up a crossface, for example. So the high pummel, imagine that my bottom leg, my left leg, is being pinned and my opponent is passing around to this side, to the free side. My aim with the high pummel is to maintain a frame on my opponent's shoulder as he's trying to close distance, and I'm trying to turn my hips towards my opponent as well as bring my hips away from my opponent. So basically what it entails is me throwing my leg as high as I can, ideally over my head if you have the mobility, and then using this pendulum to throw my hips away and then turn towards my opponent. So with this move, what makes the high pummel work is trying to lift my hips off the floor by throwing my hips up and throwing my legs towards my head. And then I need to make sure that I'm pushing off of this elbow. So there's a few things going on here. So I'm falling towards my bottom side, throwing my legs towards my head, using my abdominals to lift my hips off the floor, and then using this pendulum motion to turn my hips out. Now, if you don't have the required mobility, if you don't have the best hamstring or hip flexion mobility, you can still do this movement. You're just going to be more reliant on using momentum to bring your legs towards your head, and you're also going to have to lift your hips slightly higher off the mat. A common mistake that people will make when trying to practice this movement is not falling towards their bottom leg and not falling towards their elbow that should be framing on the mat. So if I fall directly flat on the mat, it's going to be quite hard for me to use the elbow on the mat and also quite hard for me to pendulum my leg around. So I really need to make sure that I'm falling towards my bottom leg. What we're trying to do with our bottom elbow is we're trying to push off the mat so that we can help assist our hips in moving out.
Here quite early on, you'll see an example of the high pummel where I am holding Ari's leg, and you can see he's bringing his leg over the top. So it was an ability to stop my leg getting pinned, but it's also a great way to recover from the headquarters position, because I'm going to try to settle into headquarters here. I've stepped over the leg, and he's already chopping that leg through. I think I try to clear that, and again, Ari goes back to a high pummel, and that brings his hips out to the side and gets him from turning away. So this actually goes back to having your hips turned too, where you can see in the headquarters, your hips slightly get turned facing away from your opponent towards the camera, whereas I'm trying to pass generally towards my left because I've trapped that left leg, and Ari's high pummel here gets his hips out and allows him to recover his foot back in front of me here. So the high pummel is a movement I really want you to get good at. It's so versatile. It does require some degree of hamstring flexibility, so you're going to work on that. We'll cover that in a moment. But you can see here, Dan's going for a knee cut, and he's holding on to my trapped leg. I'm framing the shoulder, and I'm going to be able to use a high pummel action here coming up. If you need to, you can grip your own leg. See, I get stuck, and I use my own hand to assist until my heel can chop on the inside of the arm or break that grip. There we are. So see how I chop on the inside of the hand, and that will break the grip. If we go back a few moments with that high pummel, if you haven't, my knee's not turned out. That's something Ari was mentioning. You need to have your knee turned out and your heel facing inwards. And once I achieve that, now I can chop down and my high pummel's worked. I've broken that grip, and now I have position that I can frame away.
The next movement we're going to be looking at is the very basic inversion from guard. Now, obviously in Jiu-Jitsu, there's heaps of different ways to invert, to attack or defend, such as the berimbolo inversion. But this particular inversion is probably the best way to get introduced into the basic inversion game and approach. So the scenario we're going to be looking at, imagine the wall is the guard passer, and the guard passer has started to go towards the side that I'm facing, and he's managed to clear my bottom leg, but I still have my top leg active. So what I'm going to be looking to do is I'm going to look to attach my top shin towards the guard passer's hip, like so. As I do this, I'm coming up towards my knee. Essentially, I'm like in a turtle position, except this knee is off the floor. What I'm going to be looking to do is I'm looking to take this bottom leg and recover it. Except I can't just simply pull my bottom leg through because the guard passer is obstructing that pathway. So if I invert all the way through, I can recover the bottom leg. So I'm going to take my head, my upper body towards my lower body so that I can recover my bottom leg. As I do this, I'm pushing off the floor with my bottom leg. I'm pivoting on my shoulder, and then the initial knee shield that I was using to stay attached to my opponent is going to help guide me all the way through so that I can square back up with my opponent. So one more time, passing towards my left, clearing my bottom leg, attaching with the top knee shield, spinning all the way through, upper body goes towards the lower body, then squaring back up again. So when I start to turn in towards my opponent into this kind of like semi-turtle position, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot bring the bottom leg back in front because the guard passer is obstructing that pathway. But we can take the leg all the way around when we spin through, like so. Similar to the Gongoa motion, the start is essentially the same, but the finish is going to be different. The reason why the finish is different is solely based on where the guard passer is when he initiates the pass and where he intends to be when he's trying to finish the pass.
There'll be plenty of examples of the invert as we go through this series, but here's a good one, and I'll just kind of explain the rationale for why I inverted here. So you can see Ari here has passed around to the side. He went to go for a he went to go for a kind of long step pass where he's gone for a crossface here, and I've just moved my head away enough for that to not stick, and framed his head enough for that to not stick. And you'll see I spin through facing inwards to recover. Okay, so generally for an invert, we're in a scenario here where, because of Ari's body positioning, I want to recover my left leg. If I could, I'd just take it to the other side of his hip, and that's fine. If I could just go in a straight line, I'd be happy. I'd be in good position, but it's blocked. So instead of going that way, it's going to spin underneath all the way around to meet that hip by going the long way. Okay, so by going this way instead of just the direct line. Okay, so that's where I make enough space, spin in, and you see that leg. Sorry, I'll do that in slower. You'll see my left leg here. This bottom leg spins around and ends up facing Ari again, going the long way. Okay, and that's the invert. There's a few times we do it. Anytime where someone's passing around, our bottom leg cannot recover, it's often a good idea to spin through. And there's some different ways we'll approach the invert as well throughout this series.
Just going to look at a second type of invert, or a different way of inverting, and which we think is probably the best. Most of the time when you see someone learning the invert, and I think it is a good way to learn it, it's probably the easier one to do. It's often the body curling in, and I kind of roll, I curl in, and then I roll from my right shoulder here to my left, like so. Okay, and that's how people are kind of learning to the invert. So again, I kind of go with my body first, and then I lift my hips, and I roll through. And you can see when I do this, I cover ground like this way. So if you watch it again, I end up moving along the wall this way. Okay. It's a good way to practice and learn the invert. But in terms of practicality, often when we invert, our big issue is the person's trying to like cross-face us and attack us on this side. So if you're trying to move into their space, that can get blocked. Okay. So often a better way is to come onto your shoulder and lift your hips first, and then tuck your head under your hips. So you see here, I'll more like move underneath myself than across. So if I'm here, I get my hips up onto my shoulder here, and then I pull myself through this space. So instead of like rolling that way, I come underneath to recover. Okay, so again, we're here. For this one, I'm going to go on my shoulder, lift my hips, and my head then follows last. My head and shoulders fall through at the end. And I can recover on a much shorter plane without having to cover that space our opponent gets to. Okay, so when we're doing this type of invert, foot's on the ground, hip lifts, head and shoulder kind of tries to tuck under this space here. We're not going shoulder first, rolling through towards the camera. We're now going to look at the leg dab, which is this is basically what we do, like a dab movement with like we can do with our arms, but with our legs like this. So you see my knees on the outside and my foot's across the midline. So my foot's on one side, knees on the other, and my other foot can go out. There is a chance here as well. So often we go like this, and then this foot will cross over as well. So we're kind of like almost dabbing between the different sides as well. Now, what is it useful for? It can help us spin. So if you imagine your opponent can, from either front or back, is trying to push my legs forward this way, or they could be in front of me and they're trying to push my legs down. For me to resist that, so if my opponent's trying to push me this way and I try to resist with my legs, it often will cause me to stack. And if they're in front of me and they try and push my legs away and I try to resist by kicking back, that will probably sit me up because I'm kind of resisting their force well. What we can do instead is this dab action like so, okay? And this can help you spin and recover. So imagine I've got someone pushing forward here, I put my knee out and foot out,
And now they're gonna have to, if they're pushing it against they're pushing the soles of my feet here. If I turn here, now they're pushing on an angle. They're not pushing at me. It's not a stack anymore. They're pushing to try to turn me now. Like if they push on both feet, that turns me. But by doing that, it gives me a very good chance to swing my feet up and dab the other way and actually recover to the side they might go to. Similarly, if someone was pushing back down from here, if I was to push back, it would sit me up. But if I turn my feet, now as they push, if I extend, it's gonna spin me back in front of them. It's hard to show that here, so I'm gonna show it against the wall. And this is actually a good way to practice it. But if I was to swing back and my opponent is pushing against my legs, if I extend back against their hands, it will spin me back towards them. So as the drill against the wall is to swing your feet to the side, like so. Lift your hips, tap both feet to the mat, to the wall, sorry. Take your outside leg off, extend with your crossed leg, and that will spin you back to face your opponent. When you're doing this leg dab, just be wary not to bring your knee across your midline. So you're not twisting your spine, you're having your knee flared like this, so it does stay on the outside and foot on the inside. Here you'll see an example of the leg dab where Sam is in the north-south position and Ari is going to change the position of his legs into this leg dab posture. As Sam steps around, you see that leg dab posture here. As Sam steps in front, that's going to allow Ari to spin back and recover back facing Sam. One of the applications of the leg dab is to prevent the double ankle stack, where they're pushing towards the stack or potentially from north-south pushing the feet away. And you'll see here I've got double ankle grips on Ari and he folds his leg. So one leg extends, you can see this leg's extended and the other one gets folded, and it makes it a very difficult plane for me to drive and lift his hips without this leg chopping down towards the ground. And as that chops down, you can see I've lost any power with my left arm to initiate the stack, and that same foot is now in front, ready to kick me away. So you can see he slides his hips back down, and he's avoided being caught in the stacked position from that. So once more, from the double ankle stack here, Ari's going to fold one of his legs and extend the other. Here we are, legs folded, other one extends, and he's got good position now to recover.
So last one, something we've covered a little earlier, how do we use, and so we talked about why we use our elbows on the ground. They can help us to move or to frame. Just a quick guide on how to use your elbows to move your hips. If your weight is on your hips, your elbows won't do anything. So you see my hips are on the ground. I try to close my elbow in and I can't. So I can close in or I can obviously open out, depending if I want to move my hips towards my elbow or move my hips away from my elbow. So if I want to move my hips to my elbow, I'm going to lift my hips up off the ground. Okay. Swing up and put weight on that elbow. If there's no weight on the elbow, it's not going to catch anything. So I need to turn to that side, swing my hips up, and I close that elbow and it pulls my hips towards. Okay. Again, put my elbow to the side, weight on that side, hips up, and I can turn towards that side. If I wanted to move my hips away from my elbow, I would close my elbow and roll to that side again. I need weight on that elbow, so I roll to that side, and then I open that elbow out, and you see it's moved my hips away. Again, we kind of sit. This one we sit forward, and when you kind of roll, you want to roll onto your shoulder a little bit. So kind of sit forward, roll onto my shoulder as I open my elbow out. So kind of go like elbow, shoulder, open my elbow, hips move away. This is a good one. You can practice moving your hips in a circle by both closing your elbow. So try to do a full 360, alternating between closing your elbow to do it and opening your elbow to do it. So I'll just give an example of this. And then we can go the other way. It's going to talk about not getting your hips turned and ways of recovering when your hips are turned, now that we've covered a few different movements. So first off, if I've got an opponent here that wants to turn my hips, if I can turn on my side far enough, their leverage is very poor to actually turn me over. So this is going to be more difficult to turn me. If you're starting to get squared up more, our elbow on the mat can prevent that. Potentially even by lifting your leg up high towards your chest and reinforcing that elbow with your hand will also stop your hips getting turned. We have a movement that we just call a crossover, or essentially it's like a pummel, where I can just swing my hips. So I kind of, one leg will drop down a little bit as the other one comes up, and it turns my hips as I do that. I must lift my hips up off the ground to do this. And we also have the high pummel, which combines closing the elbow to move my hips out to the side and swinging my leg as a pummel too. And that will give us good hip movement. And then lastly, if our hips are really turned away and we can't use that motion, then we're going to use the gongoa to square our hips back up.
We're going to talk about something that is really important, which is improving your flexibility. And it's important for two main reasons. One is it will improve your performance. So in scenarios where you would normally have gotten your guard passed, or someone would have made closer distance to you, if you have the available flexibility, you should be able to recover. And in addition to that, it also can potentially help reduce injuries, given you stretch the right part of your body. Now, how should you stretch? You're going to hear a lot of different opinions on this, and to be honest, if you look at the research, if you look at what's actually been studied, it basically says it doesn't matter whether you do hold, relax, or static stretching in terms of having long-term differences in range of motion. So what I would suggest is then do something that's simple and easy, and something that you can kind of put into a routine. So I would say at least, if you can aim to do it at least once a day. If you can do it more than that, generally I think the more the better, but at least once a day, each stretch, maybe hold for a minute or a minute and a half, just to make sure your muscle or the joint stretches as much as you want. In terms of how strong the stretch should be, well, I think it probably should be reasonably uncomfortable when you're doing the stretch. Obviously not to the point where something's going to break, but you should stretch to the point where you're not in a, you shouldn't feel like you could hold it for 10 minutes. I think you really want to be pushing the boundaries a little bit in order to get some sort of change in range of motion. Most of the stretches we're going to recommend are focused on the lower body, because it's usually our legs that are looking to pummel and work through a more extreme range of motion, while our arms are tending to be more used just to frame and block and make distance. The range of motion we want to look at is related to your hamstrings, hip external rotation, hip flexion, hip abduction, knee flexion, the front splits, and your lumbar spine. With these stretches that we're going to show, we're assuming that you have healthy joints with a normal range of motion. If you've got injuries or things that are limiting this, then definitely check with a qualified professional before you do these exercises, because it could possibly impact that, and that could potentially worsen your injury if you've got an injury. So we're assuming that you've got a normal range of motion to do these exercises. Please don't message myself or Ari on social media asking us questions about your injuries. It's pretty much impossible to diagnose or look at someone's injury over the internet. You actually have to assess it and see them in person, and we're probably both not really working as physiotherapists at this stage at the moment anyway. I should say as well, Ari is actually also a physiotherapist, so he's actually going to take us through the first thing we're going to look at, which is hip external rotation.
Yeah. I'm not a real physiotherapist. All right, so hip external rotation is basically where my hip turns outwards. It rotates outwards. So when you see your knee pointing outwards and your foot coming inwards, like this is hip external rotation. Now, as a guard player, you're not simply just going to have, like, just on its own, hip external rotation. You're also going to have hip external rotation with hip flexion. So when my knee goes towards my shoulder, like so. Looking at how hip external rotation translates over into jiu-jitsu, coupled with hip flexion, is basically like a good example is like a high puddle or a crossover. So if you have an opponent passing to a particular side of the body, so now I'm passing to the right side of Lockie's body, if he's able to fully externally rotate his hip while having his knee pushed to his chest, his foot is now able to connect with my body, and now he can use that as a block, as a frame to push me back and now recover his bottom leg. So if he doesn't have this hip external rotation, maybe he's got really good hip flexion, but his external rotation at this range of hip flexion isn't that good, then his foot is only going to be able to go to, say, here, which means I'm going to be able to complete my guard pass. Okay, so if he had better mobility, it would be a lot easier for him to get his foot in front. You could argue that if you have less mobility, you have to create better angles, but just for the purpose of being more flexible to save the guard, it is more important to have that range of motion. So looking at how to develop our hip external rotation, we're going to look at a couple of pigeon stretch variations. So if I want to develop the external rotation on my left hip, I'm going to have my left leg sitting out in front of me. My knee at the moment is going to have about 90 degrees of knee flexion, and my back leg is just going to sit behind me. The reason why we're not extending the back leg is because we're solely just focusing on developing the external rotation of the front leg. So my goal here is to progress my chest towards my shin, and I want to make sure that my knee sits in line with my shoulder. I don't want my knee to start to track inwards towards the midline. The reason why is because essentially if our knee is tracking towards our midline, we're basically developing a stretch like this. When we retain our guard though, we don't retain our guard like this. Okay, this is a bad habit to create. When we retain our guard, our knee is ideally sitting on the outside of our midline. And when we bring our foot towards our chest, this is where we should be retaining our guard from. So the first variation, like so, and you can play around with how much knee flexion or extension you have. So the more I extend my knee, the more my foot tracks up towards my head. The more I bend my knee, the closer it's going to track towards my hips. The other variation we can look at, this is probably my favorite one, and it's a lot more specific for guard retention, is where I take my foot towards the front of my other knee, and I'm going to grab onto my shin and pull my foot and my right knee to my chest, like so. This is a much more specific stretch for the hip external rotation for guard retention. What I also like to do, once I've developed this range, is to kind of use like an active stretch by pulling my knee to my chest, like so. What I also like to do, once I've developed my passive range of motion here, I'm going to start to try and develop my active range by actively pulling both of my knees towards my chest, like so.
The next movement we're looking at is hip flexion. So that's the ability to pull your knee, I'll say towards your chest, but in reality, you kind of get blocked by your chest. You want to be able to pull it kind of past, just laterally past your chest, so in a slight amount of what we call abduction, and pulling almost past your shoulder here. This is a very important movement for guard retention for a few reasons. If I borrow Ari here, for example, under north-south, often if I have good hip flexion, I can pull my knee almost behind my shoulder and use that now to push, frame, and make space to recover. We already talked about our hip external rotation, but that's in combination with flexion. So if my knee's not flexed, if my knee's far away from my chest, and I externally rotate, I might not reach Ari. But if I can pull my knee up and externally rotate, so knee closer to my chest, I got much more chance of bringing my leg in front. A really good test to see whether you need to improve your hip flexion, or at least this is going to make a massive difference if you can do this. If you make an outstretched hand, like you're making a frame and Ari was closing the distance, if you have enough hip flexion, so I pull my knee towards my chest, that I can put my foot behind where my hand is, I can replace a frame. If you're lacking, if you have a frame, you can't actually bring your foot behind your hand to replace it. So if you only can flex to here, for example, you're going to struggle to recover in a lot of positions where you want to build and maintain frames on the previous frame. Lastly, it's also quite an important movement for recovering and retracting a trapped leg. For example, here, if I have like a knee shield, often we want to pull that bottom leg back to enable us to recover. The way I like to stretch hip flexion is to step one leg forward like this, keep the knee pointing up, and have your back leg out straight behind you. You can even put your toes on the mat to kind of keep that position. Put your armpit past your knee and slowly work down, not twisting your shoulders, keeping your shoulders facing the ground, and try to get your shoulders flat on the ground if you can, like this. So keeping your foot planted, try and get your shoulders to the ground, not flaring your knee out and not twisting like this. Okay, both of that would be cheating. I really want to go from here straight down like so, and you should feel that stretching somewhere around the back of the hip. The next movement we're looking at is hamstring flexibility. And when I say hamstring, I'm actually talking about two different things. There is your hamstring itself, and there's also your sciatic nerve. And this is a slightly different way we stretch these, and slightly different applicability of this as well. So where this is useful for is, let's say Ari is stacking me. One thing I don't want, it's actually bad for my back. Generally, the more your back gets bent when you get stacked, the worse it is for your back and for your neck. And hamstring flexibility helps a lot with this. Well, this one's actually sciatic nerve predominantly, but Ari starts to lift my hips to stack me or push my feet. And the more flexible the earlier I can touch my feet to the mat, that's basically when my hips stop lifting. Okay? So I'm just going to give you an example. If my knees are bent like this and I can't extend them any further, if Ari pushes here, my hips lift right up, my neck gets jammed. This is really bad for me, okay? Whereas my hamstrings, which is my ability to extend my knee like this, I'm flexed at the hip, my knee's towards my chest, so with that hip flexion like before, and my knee can extend as well, okay? And when Ari stretches me here, I can put my feet back and my hips only lift so much, okay? And actually, performance is good for injury, but also performance. I don't want my back exposed to Ari. So if I can keep my hips low, it's hard for him to pass. If my hips are up here, he can really block my back. My back is exposed, and the pass becomes easy. I'm just going to show you on Ari, because Ari is particularly flexible with his hamstrings, and he's very hard to pass under the legs against. Push here, you can see how little his hips lift and how difficult it is from here to actually get underneath to try to actually stack it. So hamstring flexibility is also quite important for pummeling our legs, especially for the high pummel. So as Ari starts to come around, the more I can lift my leg up and back here, see how that's stretching Ari, it becomes more difficult to follow my leg and I can chop through. Okay? If I'm lacking in hamstring flexibility, I can only get to here, I cannot move back in, I can't chop across that. So you really need to be able to pull your leg up nice and high to be able to chop across and have an effective high pummel. So we'll now talk about stretching the hamstring and the sciatic nerve. I'll talk about what's different between the two of them now. So your sciatic nerve is the nerve that runs behind your hips, behind your knee, and it also goes up through, well, it's not speaking the sciatic nerve, but there's a continuation of
of the nerve behind your ankle and into your foot as well. So what happens is, if you have a straight knee, dorsiflex foot, so you pull your toes back, and you're flexing your hip this way too, having your other leg outstretched, this will be sciatic nerve, and you often feel that at the back of your knee, sometimes down towards your calf if you stretch like this. Whereas hamstring is just a single, well, it's a muscle that crosses just two joints. It's just your hip and just your knee. So you can relieve pressure from the sciatic nerve by pointing your toes, and then we can just focus on the hamstring itself. I'm going to flex the hip first, so pull my knee towards my chest, and then I'm pulling my foot back like that. And here I feel this a lot more along my hamstring itself rather than the back of the knee like we do with the sciatic nerve stretch. And as I said, these movements are different. Often for something like a high pummel, it's more like the hamstring, whereas for getting stacked, it's more with our legs straight and it's affecting the sciatic nerve. So how do we stretch these? Great way, grab your belt or anything you got, a towel. For the sciatic nerve, put it towards the end of your toes, straighten your leg, okay, and take up as much slack as you want. Straighten your leg, and then having your other leg out pretty much flat on the ground, so make sure your knee touches the ground, everything facing directly straight. We're going to slowly pull our leg further and further until you feel the stretch. Okay. For the hamstring, you're going to put it down near the heel, so you're allowed to point your toes a little bit. Pull yourself into full flexion of the hip, so pulling your knee tight to your chest, and then we can use our hands to extend the knee, and I feel that much more on the hamstring itself. You can see my other knees lifting up, trying to make sure I actively push that back knee down to the ground.
The next movement we're going to be looking at is hip abduction. So what hip abduction is where I'm taking my hip away from my center line. Now, we're not just going to be solely looking at hip abduction in isolation because we're talking about guard. We're going to be looking at hip abduction coupled with hip flexion. Looking at why hip abduction is really important from a guard player's perspective. Main reason is because we can stop our legs from being redirected away and also to stop one of our legs from being past the center line. So if Lucky had really poor hip abduction and he could only open his hips to here, it would be really easy for me to redirect his hips. Okay, so I could bullfight, I could leg drag, I could start to fold his legs to one side a lot easier. If he's got really good hip abduction, it means he can open his hips really well. His knees can open out like so. So now it's a lot harder for me to redirect his hips because as I go to redirect one of his legs, his feet can hit the floor really well. And in the case of him using a gongoa movement, he can actually square up with me a lot easier. Right, so easiest way to develop your hip abduction is by using the wall adductor stretch. So Lucky's just laying on his back, his hips are quite close to the wall, and he's just abducted both of his hips, and he's just resting his feet on the wall. So you can see gravity is just going to be pushing his legs apart, and over time he should be able to get deeper into the range. Now, if you're having trouble with this stretch, if you find it's quite difficult, what you can also try and do is move your hips slightly away from the wall so that there's less hip flexion, which means it's going to be less stressful on your hips. So as you can notice here, Lucky's got his really stylish socks on. Reason why he's put the socks on is because if you're stretching on a padded wall, there may be a lot of friction with bare skin on the wall, which means your feet won't be able to slide down. So basically, if you chuck some socks on, over time it makes it easier for your feet to slide down the wall, meaning you can get a greater range of hip abduction.
Something to consider as well is the amount of knee flexion that you have. Knee flexion is your ability to pull your heel towards your butt, like this, okay? And there's a passive range, like you'll see I have a good passive range. I can pull my heel right to my butt like this, but actively I'm slightly limited on that, right? But why is that important? Especially the active range. If, for example, Ari goes under the legs, oftentimes when we pummel, we have to like close the gap with our foot. If my knee only bends to this much, then I'm not going to be able to get it through that gap, okay? But if I have the ability to tuck my foot in tighter, now as Ari drives forward, that actually
lets me pummel my foot underneath. So often for our pummeling, we want to really like chop into good knee flexion.
Now, if you're limited passively, then one way you can do it is just practicing slowly sitting down with your butt on your heels. This is something that even if you're stiff with, over time, you'll probably find this slowly will improve and you can get full knee flexion here. Now, if there's a difference between your active and your
Passive range, so when I lack it here, it's often because the bulk of your calf and hamstring can get in the, as you contract, gets in the way of actually getting your heel towards your butt. That's not something you can necessarily change too much.
The amount of lumbar or thoracic spine flexion can also be important for guard retention, for Ari. That means
The ability to bend your spine backwards, like this, curling back, like so. Okay. One of the main reasons is injury prevention. So if my spine, especially if my hamstrings are tight and my lower back and upper back are tight, if Ari starts to stack, the pressure just goes straight to my neck like this, and this is bad. Okay? You need to like bail very early as soon as pressure's starting to go to your neck. Right? But even with stiff hamstrings, if you've got a reasonably flexible lower back and upper back, you might still be able to kind of take some pressure off your neck, like so. All right. So having a good amount of mobility is gonna help for your spine, particularly for injury prevention. But also you want to be able to actually lift and move your hips up off the ground, which is going to come from your spine. So you can actually turn and pivot and have a very small amount of surface on the ground. Now,
one thing we're not going to do is give you exercises to stretch your spine. It is something that if you do it wrong or if you have a pre-existing injury, it could potentially cause an injury. So if you want to work on that, we suggest you see a practitioner and they can give you some advice that's specific for you.